Hello viewers, welcome to the Bachelor course of Population Studies. Today we will discuss about the concept of population control. The human population, like other organisms, has the capability of growing exponentially or very quickly. But no population can grow indefinitely. When a population of any species grows, its density increases, causing more intensive competition among members of the population, which results in a shortage of resources and ultimately death. Competition among humans leads to war. We have experienced 2 world wars and many low-scale wars. The root of wars is competition for resources, although other factors such as religious, ideological and ethnic differences may become the triggers. The human population grew slowly in the beginning. It took several hundred thousands of years before it reached 1 billion in 1804. But 123 years later, in 1927, it grew to 2 billion. Subsequently, the time needed to add another billion people on Earth got shorter. The population reached 3 billion in 1960, 4 billion in 1974, 5 billion in 1987, 6 billion in 1999 and 7 billion in 2011. The curve of human population growth shows a very slight rise during a period of several 100,000 years, but at the end of the curve it rises drastically. Many nations on earth do not have enough food to feed their populations. However, recently the ability to increase food production is being hindered by bizarre weather patterns. In various regions of earth, including in America, important food production areas are being challenged with floods. In other places, drought has been a serious problem. Unfortunately, though damaging as these natural disasters are, a more troubling danger contributing to world hunger is that of unequal distribution and shortages caused not by a lack of supply, but in unsold grain and food stocks that are kept off the market in order to keep the prices of grain high. Far from being a nefarious policy, this is done primarily to keep farmers in business. Despite the many advances, technologically speaking, in agricultural production techniques, hunger on a massive scale still exists in many parts of the world. The intervention of the world's governments and by private institutions has been extensive and commendable. Nevertheless, large pockets of poverty and starvation remain in parts of Asia, Africa and Latin America. Early in the 19th century, the English scholar Reverend Thomas Malthus published an essay on the principle of population. He wrote that overpopulation was the root of many problems industrial European society suffered from. Poverty, malnutrition and disease could all be attributed to overpopulation. According to Malthus, this was a mathematical inevitability. Malthus observed that while resources tended to grow arithmetically, populations exhibit exponential growth. Thus, if left unrestricted, human populations would continue to grow until they would become too large to be supported by the food grown on available agricultural land. In other words, humans would outpace their local carrying capacity, the capacity of ecosystems or societies to support the local population. As a solution, Malthus urged moral restraint, that is, he declared that people must practice abstinence before marriage. Forced sterilization where necessary and institute criminal punishments for so-called unprepared parents who had more children than they could support. Even in his time, this solution was controversial. According to Malthus, the only alternative to moral restraint was certain disaster. If allowed to grow unchecked, population would outstrip available resources, resulting in what came to be known as Malthusian catastrophes, naturally occurring checks on population growth such as famine, disease or war. Over the 200 years following Malthus' projections, famine has overtaken numerous individual regions. Proponents of this theory, neo-Malthusians, state that these famines were examples of Malthusian catastrophes. On a global scale, however, food production has grown faster than population due to transformational advances in agricultural technology. It has often been argued that future pressures on food production combined with threats to other aspects of the Earth's habitat such as global warming make overpopulation a still more serious threat in the future. After all, we have not experienced a worldwide shortage of resources as warned by Malthus several hundred years ago or by the Club of Rome several decades ago. Population control. The concept of population control is a policy of attempting to limit the growth in numbers of a population, especially in poor and densely populated parts of the world, by programs of contraception or sterilization. Population control is any methodology used to control the type, location and number of people that inhabit the earth. Public debate is strictly limited, however, to non-coercive means in achieving any one of these goals, especially with regards to population reduction. An important example of this would be allowing people the free choice on procreative matters. By using various methodologies, both economic and administrative and educational, to dissuade people from having more children than needed, a stable population base can be created. Higher population size results in lower resource availability. An increase of births over deaths results in a higher rate of natural increase and rapid population growth. Rapid population growth affects capital formation, food shortages, consumer prices, labor problems and social and political unrest. Money shortages affect the ability to meet day-to-day needs and expenditures rise. Rural and urban development is affected. School enrollments in institutions of higher education can also be affected. Economic disruption results in a widening circle of poverty and a reduced standard of living. Production costs are affected. In developing countries, there is a need to reduce the birth rate, to promote economic development, to achieve optimum population size and to improve the quality of life. Population control is the appropriate alternative to promote, sustain and enhance development. The population under 30 years of age should be targeted as a means of protecting the interests of family, community and nation. In order to reach the stage of development of Western Europe and North America, for example, less developed countries with 75% of the world's population must achieve social and economic advancement, including low birth rates and low rates of population growth. Population control has been promoted mainly because of the following considerations: to prevent a fall in living standards and the consequence of such a fall, population growth should not outstrip the growth of subsistence. The growth of the population needs to be contained within the biophysical carrying capacity of the earth, otherwise it will lead to overexploitation of natural resources, greatly damaging the ecosystem. In addition to such economic and environmental concerns, promotion of population control also reflects people's varying views of social reform and is regarded as an important step toward enhancing the health of women and their families, protecting people's reproductive choices and improving sexual expression for both sexes through freedom from fear of pregnancy. Initiation of controlling population. The concept of population control gained momentum and a sense of urgency after World War II. However, the movement to reduce population growth encountered an unexpected array of complex practical and moral problems. Especially in the 1960s and 70s, the heyday of population control, the movement gave a lot of wrong answers. At first, family planning involved purely voluntary efforts, but that approach looked increasingly inadequate as the high birth rates in the world's poor countries combined with declining death rates due to improved nutrition and health led to rapid increases in population. This sense of crisis nudged orthodox family planning in the direction of population control. Now, contraception and sterilization were aggressively promoted in poor countries and specific goals for fertility reduction were set. It was also agreed to pay incentives to those who accepted sterilization or intrauterine devices. As various Western governments, foundations and non-governmental organizations rushed to create programs, they looked to the new United Nations Fund for Population Activities as the natural leader. Because family planning faced popular resistance in many poor countries, along with widespread suspicion that it was designed to limit the size and power of the third world, it was thought that the UN imprimatur would show that population control was a worthy objective for all humanity. UNFPA got most of its money from foreign aid donors and it was governed by an independent board rather than the UN member states, an arrangement that gave it great freedom of action. By 1970, a total of 27 countries had announced that they aimed to cut birth rates, but only South Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, India and Pakistan had substantial programs. Everywhere, proponents claimed that there remained enormous unmet need for contraceptives. Sweden quadrupled its aid for family planning between 1971 and 1977. Starting at a lower level, Norway, Japan and the Netherlands increased their budgets eightfold. The biggest challenge was to establish and rapidly scale up programs in countries that lacked even rudimentary public health services. Consultants tended to promote standardized techniques. In India, Indonesia, Tunisia and the Dominican Republic, truck-borne mobile clinics were sent into the countryside dispensing contraceptives to anyone who would take them. But the consultants failed to reckon with inadequate roads that wreaked havoc on the trucks, not to mention the lack of interest in what the clinics had to offer. In poor rural societies, children provided parents with their only security in old age, and many died young in places where the water was alive with harmful microbes and the mosquitoes carried malaria. In fact, in many areas, parents grumbled that aid workers didn't help childless couples with their family planning or offer other kinds of health care. The consequences of family control initiatives. Population control, the catchword of the 1950s and 1960s, was the silent reality of the 1970s and 1980s. Predictably, third world populations have borne the brunt of new drug experimentation and resulting population control policies. Experimental contraceptives were sponsored by Seattle in Bangladesh. Women in Puerto Rico and Mexico were used to test contraceptives without their consent. Depo-Provera was used experimentally on 8,000 women in San Pablo, Mexico, 1,20,000 in Sri Lanka and 2,50,000 in Bangladesh. Policies of sterilization of native people have been pursued throughout the world. Since 1960, US aid has been a major funder of third world population control, providing half of the money for internationally funded birth control programs and family planning services, including the pill, IUD and sterilization. Family planning was meant to help people take charge of their own lives, but in India and other developing countries, it often came to mean applying varying degrees of coercion, from pushing risky contraceptives on reluctant clients to paying cash rewards to poor people who agreed to be sterilized. In the pursuit of their great goal, population controllers proved willing to sacrifice other efforts to improve the well-being of poor people around the world. And they were so persuaded of the necessity and rightness of their mission that they shielded much of their work from oversight and, more important, accountability to those they were supposed to serve. Critics pointed out that better health care for mothers and infants, clean drinking water and improved nutrition and other public health services might have changed the equation for many poor people, but the aid givers were bent on their single-minded vision. Funding for already neglected public health services was to be redirected toward population control, while other forms of aid were restricted. In the 1970s, many more national governments adopted numerical targets, and a few went beyond incentives to disincentives. Indonesia denied public servants rations for younger children in large families. Anyone in Singapore who had more than 3 children was kicked out of public housing. By 1977, Bangladesh, Egypt, India, South Korea, Pakistan, Taiwan and Tunisia were all paying family planning personnel according to the numbers of IUDs inserted. US aid was also offering to pay hospitals in Indonesia, Pakistan and the Philippines a fee for each sterilization performed. In many countries, freelance motivators were paid to recruit patients. Indian experience of population control initiatives. India's national program was the most closely studied because it had been the first country to commit to population control and absorbed the lion's share of international aid. In the state of Maharashtra, a 1971 government study produced the surprising finding that 3/4 of husbands who many supposed would object to having fewer children were initially happy with their wives' decision to adopt the IUD. But more than half changed their minds. Almost 58% of the women experienced pain after IUD insertion and 43% had severe and excessive bleeding. Most field workers, the study reported, had no training in family planning. Peace Corps volunteers in the state of Bihar saw first-hand one reason why so many women suffered side effects. Rather than sterilize the inserter after each procedure, workers would simply wipe it on their saris. When the volunteers alerted Ford Foundation consultants, they were told to stay focused on program targets. Indian women began refusing IUDs. It took nearly 20 years to restore the device popularity. When programs failed to meet targets, consultants working for the UN, the World Bank and the International Planned Parenthood Federation advised governments to provide incentives worth up to a month's wages directly to acceptors who agreed to sterilization. In some areas, government officials were offered what amounted to bounties for finding volunteers, prompting some of them to mobilize the police and tax collectors. In the state of Kerala, local officials set up a sterilization camp and carried out some 60,000 procedures in a single month in 1971. It was hard to overlook the fact that many of those recruited were desperately poor people tempted by the cash incentives. The numbers of acceptors rose and fell with the level of incentive payments and shot up in times when famine threatened. Often, the programs attracted the wrong acceptors. In Uttar Pradesh, India's most populous state, one study found that the ages of those undergoing vasectomies had been systematically falsified. Almost half were more than 50 years old. But bribing people to agree to sterilization was not merely ineffective. It made family planning seem like an imposition rather than something that served clients' own interests. Population control, the China's policy. China has the highest population in the world, encompassing 1.2 billion or 21% of the world's population. China faces serious social and economic problems associated with overpopulation in the years to come. Overly populated regions lead to degradation of land, resources, pollution, and detrimental living conditions. The Chinese government has tried to find a solution to the problem of increasing population with moderate success. The Chinese government has used several methods to control population growth. In 1979, China started the one child per family policy. This policy stated that citizens must obtain a birth certificate before the birth of their children. The citizens would be offered special benefits if they agreed to have only one child. Citizens who did have more than one child would either be taxed an amount up to 50% of their income or punished by loss of employment or other benefits. Furthermore, unplanned pregnancies or pregnancies without the proper authorization would need to be terminated. In 1980, the birth quota system was established to monitor population growth. Under this system, the government set target goals for each region. Local officials were mainly held responsible for making sure that population growth totals did not exceed target goals. If target goals were not met, the local officials were punished by law or by loss of privileges. We can conclude that global crises do not necessarily have global solutions. Would-be humanitarians must listen to what people actually want and develop answers appropriate to each need, without simply assuming they know best. The world at large, unfortunately, still has no clue as to the reasons and methods of the population control agenda, and that it is one of the highest priorities of most of the world's governments. Not just the Malthusian aspect, but every aspect of this agenda is important when governments formulate their policies, be it domestic or foreign. That's all with today's lecture. I hope this must have added to your knowledge. Next time, we'll discuss about techniques of population control. Till then, have a nice time. Bye-bye.